So I'm going to be talking about the Rape of Nanking and why that genocide occurred. So for my introduction, the Rape of Nanking was extremely unjust. Horrific acts of violence were rained on the prisoners of war and the innocent civilians. This genocide was a result of the vicious Japanese army in an act of retaliation against the Chinese after they put up a resilient fight in the Japanese effort of expansion. The following is a quote from the history place, and it is one of the Western foreigners' quote from him bearing witness to the horrible atrocities that occurred. He stated, "The incredible carnage, citywide burnings, stabbings, drownings, strangulations, rapes, thefts, and massive property destruction continued to abate for about 6 weeks from mid-December 1937 through the beginning of February 1938. The streets of Nanking were said to literally have run red with blood." The first question that we were faced with was, how long had Japan and China been at war before the capture of Nanking? Japan and China had already had conflicts from the past, and the war began when Japan began their ground invasion in Manchuria. This happened following the Mukden incident of 1931. In which the Japanese military orchestrated a railroad bombing and blamed it on the warlords that were in China, and used it as means to further annex the city of Manchuria. After their conquer of this city, the Japanese continued to move north in China to expand their influence further. And after 6 years of fighting in China, the Japanese and Chinese battled at Marco Polo in July of 1937. That battle lasted through the summer into the fall, which extremely frustrated the Japanese military and resulted in extreme retaliation in the Japanese Rape of Nanking, which followed in December of the same year. Here's an additional quote from BBC News. The Japanese again had initial success, but then there was a period of successful Chinese defense before the Japanese broke through at Shanghai and swiftly moved on to Nanjing. The next question that we will be going over is, was there a Chinese resistance movement in the city during the Japanese occupation? So the Chinese resistance was a little unclear, as there was political and civil unrest going on in China before the war even occurred. There was a lack of political unity, and the Emperor Chiang at the time was initially more focused on eliminating the threats that were internally in China rather than dealing with the foreign infiltration of Japan. After the communist efforts in China declared war against Japan, Chiang was finally confronted by the CCP and was released in order to unify China against Japan. But this was a last-minute effort, as it occurred in 1936, and the Japanese were only further motivated to declare their war and infiltrate more of China. The following question is, what role did foreigners play in the Nanking during the Japanese control of the city? And so foreigners during this time were the only ones available for the Chinese to seek refuge with. There were quite a few Western foreign civilians that were living in Nanking at that time, and many of them had bared witness to the awful events that were occurring and created an international safety zone, which allowed Chinese civilians and unarmed soldiers to seek refuge there. Their heroism saved the lives of 300,000 Chinese refugees, and these people as well worked to document their accounts of the carnage that they were witnessing. And so I added some quotations from them. The first one is, "Westerners became the unsung heroes of Nanking, working day and night to the point of exhaustion to aid the Chinese. They also wrote down their impressions of daily scenes they witnessed, with one describing Nanking as hell on earth. Another, I did not imagine that such cruel people existed in the modern world." In an additional quote by one of the leaders of the Safety Zone states, "We Europeans are paralyzed with horror. There are executions everywhere. Some are being carried out with machine guns outside the barracks of the War Ministry. As I write this, the fists of Japanese soldiers are hammering at the back gate of the garden." These people had to witness many of the corpses laying in the streets and the awful events that were occurring. They saw young girls dragged away by the Japanese, and honestly, their only savior was the fact that they were not Chinese civilians. One last quote by Minnie Vautrin, who actually later committed suicide after the atrocities that she witnessed. "There is probably no crime that has not been committed in this city today. How many thousands were mowed down by guns or bayoneted, we shall probably never know. Charred bodies tell the tales of some of these tragedies." These people witnessed such horrific acts that they could not comprehend how they were even occurring. Many people were made aware of the situation going on, and news outlets knew what was going on. Things were coming to the States even, and people just could not believe that these atrocities were occurring. And many felt unable to help. And these Western foreigners that were actually down in the barracks in Nanjing, they were actually able to save so many lives just by their efforts. The next question is, were the Japanese ever held accountable for their actions in Nanking? Japanese accountability has never fully been accepted. They have never accepted responsibility for the tragic acts inflicted on the Chinese, especially in Nanking. Though some retired military have actually admitted to the horror, many Japanese completely deny what took place. And after a historian named Iris Chang released a book detailing the vicious brutality on the part of the Japanese, she was faced with death threats and mockery by Japanese officials. Even in her death, she was defaced in her memory and condemned as a liar. After her death, the Japanese continued to deface her memory, and they actually stated that by the end she must have known her arguments were without merit and that we exposed the lies within her book, stating that basically she had always been a liar and that none of these events had actually ever occurred. And this woman was a journalist who became very famous within the United States, and she was actually a child of Chinese immigrants who had experienced the horrors of Nanking, and she was overcome with emotional trauma due to all that happened, and she ended up taking her own life as it all had become overbearing. One quote from Azuma Shiro, who was a soldier of the Japanese, said, "There was a woman holding a child on her right arm and another on her left. We stabbed and killed them all three, like potatoes on a skewer. I thought then, since it's only been 1 month since I left home, and 30 days later, I was killing people without remorse." The following question is, was there a long history of less than good relations between China and Japan? I believe that the Chinese and Japanese relations were very strained. The Japanese were feeling wronged and frustrated by the continued success of China's exports, especially in the textile industry. And Japan was also given territory in China after World War I, which was followed by a lot of civil unrest through demonstrations of protest and boycotts of foreign business within China, with, I believe, the eventual return of that land, which probably led to the Japanese further interest in the annexation of Manchuria. And lastly, what role, if any, did Japanese culture play in provoking the genocide? I believe that the Japanese cultural impacts did affect what happened. Japan is strongly influenced by their samurai ancestors, and children are taught from a very young age that surrender is a sign of unthinkable weakness, and they do have a strict military code they must follow. The Japanese were extremely embarrassed after what happened at the Battle of Marco Polo and the fact that it had lasted through the summer into fall. The Rape of Nanking was a beyond extreme retaliation on the part of the Japanese, and they still claim that these acts are fabricated exaggeration and that the violence never took place as a just that took place was as just as any wartime efforts, but what occurred there was a tragic event, and the acts that these Japanese soldiers inflicted on those people can never be forgiven and can never be taken back. And the fact that the Japanese still deny these acts and allegations is extremely emotionally traumatizing to all of those affected by this. My conclusion states that the genocide that is known as the Rape of Nanking occurred as a result of the extreme desire of the Japanese to expand control and power. They shamelessly inflicted the maximum pain and suffering on civilians and brutally tortured prisoners of war. Japan had a history of feeling wronged by the Chinese. They had felt that the war and expansion would come easily due to the lack of unity in China leading up to the war. Japan was faced with the embarrassment and the prolonged fighting in China with an unexpected resiliency on the Chinese army's part. This was partly due to the culture of military excellence and strength present in Japan. The Japanese felt compelled to enact cruel violence to the utmost extremes, resulting in the murder and generational trauma of those inflicted with this pain. Hopefully you have learned something from this presentation. This was a very horrific act that occurred, and it is something that more people should be made aware of. I went to a public school, and I was never taught about this horrific incident, and I believe that this event is truly another form of the Holocaust and a horrific act that many people have suffered from in physical results of the physical lasting effects, such as many of the testimonies of survivors, and they're ridden with pain still to this day over what happened, along with the emotional trauma of watching many of their family members and friends be brutally tortured and murdered. And just bearing witness to these events and researching them has taken the lives of, like I said, one of the Western foreigners, Americans, who experienced the events. She committed suicide, as well as the historian named Chang, who succumbed to the emotional overwhelmingness of these tragic events, and as well as the fear of Japanese retaliation in her speaking out on these issues, because even after her death, the Japanese continued to deface her memory and deny these allegations yet again.